All right, so we're back and ready for a deep dive. And this time, we're tackling pharmacy. I've been looking over these orientation notes you sent, and I gotta admit, it's a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, it's a massive field for sure, but that's what makes it so interesting, right? Always something new to learn.
Totally. And one thing that jumped out was the role of international organizations. Like, obviously, the WHO is a big player, but what kind of challenges are they facing these days, when it comes to making sure everyone has access to safe medications?
Well, it's a constant juggling act, that's for sure. I mean, you've got to navigate geopolitical hurdles, and then there are economic disparities. And don't even get me started on counterfeit drugs.
Oh, right. Counterfeit medications. That's a whole other beast.
It's a huge problem, a billion-dollar industry, unfortunately.
Wow. I hadn't even considered that.
And then on top of that, you have organizations like the FDA here in the US, laser focused on making sure the medications themselves are safe, all
Uh-huh.
those clinical trials, rigorous testing protocols.
Yeah, the FDA, they're like the guardians of pharmaceutical safety, right?
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the UN Division of Narcotic Drugs.
Right, because we can't forget about the potential for abuse with certain medications.
Absolutely. And their job is to make sure those medications are used responsibly, trying to prevent a global crisis, really. It's a tough job.
It sounds like it. So it's really this interconnected web of organizations working together.
Precisely. And they all play a critical role. Often, they're even collaborating with each other. Take the WHO, for instance.
Uh-huh.
They might establish these international standards for drug safety, and then here in the US, it's up to the FDA to implement and enforce those standards.
It's like a global relay race to keep everything running smoothly.
Exactly. And it's not just those big international players. We've got a whole network of national organizations here in Egypt doing crucial work.
Right, like the Egyptian Syndicate of Pharmacists.
Hmm.
They're all about ethical guidelines, right? Making sure pharmacists are supported.
Absolutely. They advocate for the profession, set those ethical standards, and really focus on professional development.
Yeah, it's like their union in a way. And something I found interesting was their emphasis on continuing education. It seems like the world of pharmacy is always changing.
You're telling me. New research, new medications constantly emerging. Lifelong learning is essential in this field, and that's where organizations like the Egyptian Pharmaceutical Society come in. They publish journals, organize conferences, all about keeping pharmacists in the loop.
It makes sense though, right? I mean, nobody wants to be prescribing outdated treatments.
Exactly. And speaking of specialized care, there's also the Egyptian Society of Hospital Pharmacists. They deal with some really complex cases, working closely with physicians to adjust medications for patients with very specific needs.
Yeah, it's a whole different ballgame compared to your average pharmacy.
For sure. And of course, we can't overlook the National Pharmaco Committee. They have the massive task of deciding what medications get listed in the pharmacopoeia, that massive book of medicines.
Oh, wow. So they're the ones determining what's in the Egyptian medicine cabinet, so to speak.
Essentially, yes. They review research, make sure each drug meets the highest safety and quality standards, and evaluate its overall effectiveness.
Sounds like a huge responsibility. Okay, so we've got all these organizations, both on an international and national level, working to ensure these medications are safe and effective. But with so much information out there, how does a pharmacist even begin to stay current?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. We were talking about all these information sources, primary, secondary, tertiary. How do you even keep it all straight?
It's a lot, that's for sure, but it's crucial for pharmacists. Take clinical trial data, for example. To really understand a new drug, you have to go straight to the source.
Those primary research articles they publish in journals?
Exactly, like the Journal of Controlled Release. That, and others like it. They're how researchers share their findings.
I've seen those. But honestly, they can be a bit intimidating to dig through. Absolutely. Even for experienced pharmacists, that's where those secondary sources come in handy. Things like PubMed Central.
Right, those databases.
Yeah.
I use those when I want to sound smart but don't actually want to read a 5-page research paper.
Exactly. They do the heavy lifting for you, coming through all that research. Let's say a new diabetes drug comes out. I can go on PubMed and look at all the reviews and see how it stacks up against the other treatments.
That makes a lot of sense. But still, are you telling me you read every single clinical trial out there?
No way. Nobody has time for that. You have to be smart about it. Understanding the structure of a research article is key.
Okay, so give us the inside scoop. Where do you even start?
The abstract, always. That's your quick summary, tells you the purpose, the methods, the findings, even the conclusions. Think of it like a movie trailer.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
So if the abstract grabs my attention, then what?
You'll want to check out the introduction next. That's where they give you the background info, explain why they're doing this research in the first place.
So it sets the stage.
Exactly. Then you've got the methodology section. That's where they get into the nitty-gritty of how they conducted the study. Think of it like a recipe.
And this is important
Plus, it
because
lets you evaluate the quality of the research. Did they use an appropriate sample size? Did they have proper controls? You need to know these things before you incorporate their findings into your practice.
so it's not just about the results themselves, but how they got those results.
Exactly. Once you've gone through that, then you can move on to the good stuff, the results section. That's where they present their findings, usually with visuals and graphs, which
Yeah.
can be helpful,
A good graph goes a long way.
for sure. And then comes the discussion section. This is where the researchers interpret their findings, talk about any limitations to the study, and tie it all back to the initial question they were trying to answer.
So they connect the dots.
Right. And then, even though it's at the end, don't forget the reference section. It lists all the sources they cited, so if you want to go even deeper down the rabbit hole, you can.
It's like those suggested readings lists you get in school, but way more intense.
Absolutely. And speaking of more to learn, all this new research ties directly back to the work those national pharmacy organizations are doing here in Egypt.
Right, like the Egyptian Pharmaceutical Society. They're all about making sure pharmacists are up to date.
Exactly.
Which makes me wonder, are there any big debates happening right now within these organizations? Things that our listeners, who are clearly fascinated by pharmacy, would find interesting.
Oh, for sure. There's a huge push right now to expand the role of pharmacists in patient care. We're talking about possibly giving pharmacists more prescribing authority, maybe even integrating them more into primary care teams.
Wow, that's fascinating. I bet the Egyptian Syndicate of Pharmacists has some strong opinions on that.
Absolutely. They're advocating for expanded roles and making sure pharmacists have a voice in those discussions. It's a really interesting time to be involved in the pharmacy world here in Egypt.
It sounds like it. So with all these developments and all this new research, it seems like these organizations also play a big role in educating not just pharmacists, but the public as well.
You're absolutely right.
It's amazing how much the role of a pharmacist has changed, even just thinking about the last couple of years.
It's really incredible. I mean, it's not just about filling prescriptions anymore. Pharmacists have to be on top of all the latest research. They have to really understand the science behind the medications, and they have to work closely with other healthcare providers.
It's like they're becoming medication therapists.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where those tertiary sources come in, the ones we talked about earlier, those big textbooks like the Martindale and the Merck Index.
Yeah, they're like the encyclopedias of pharmaceuticals. Although, I have to admit, sometimes I just default to Google.
Oh, of course, we all do. But those textbooks are still important. They provide that solid foundation of knowledge.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But you're right, you can't forget about the internet these days, especially with sites like PharmInfonet and PharmWeb. Those are fantastic resources.
They are, aren't they? I can get lost for hours on those sites. There's so much information.
I can imagine. But it made me think, we've been talking a lot about research and the evolving role of pharmacists, but what does it all mean for the average person? How can people become more informed about their own medications and their health in general?
Such an important question. And honestly, I think it starts with being curious. Don't be afraid to ask your pharmacist questions. We're happy to help.
I'm sure you are, although I have to admit, sometimes even those medication leaflets can be tough to decipher.
Oh, tell me about it. They're not exactly written for the average person.
Yeah.
But you know, that's one area where the FDA's website can be really helpful. They've got a ton of information that's actually easy to understand. Stuff on drug approval, safety alerts, even tips on how to talk to your doctor about your medication.
It's like having a cheat sheet for your health.
Cheat-
But with so much information online these days, it's hard to know what to trust.
You're right. It's more important than ever to be careful about where you're getting your information. Stick to those reliable sources.
Right.
Government websites, professional organizations, established medical journals. Those are your best bets.
Right, because not everything on the internet is accurate, even if it looks official.
Exactly.
This deep dive has really emphasized how important it is to be your own health advocate.
Couldn't agree more. The more you know, the more empowered you are to talk to your doctor, ask the right questions, and make the best decisions for your own well-being.
Well said. And on that note of empowerment, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive on pharmacy.
Until next time, keep those questions coming and keep exploring this fascinating field.
And remember, everyone, knowledge is power when it comes to your health. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.